Imagine standing in the heart of St. Louis in the early 1900s, the city buzzing with the clatter of streetcars, horse-drawn carriages, and the constant hum of ambition. Picture a man, Ellis Wainwright, walking down the avenue, his tailored suit pressed perfectly, a gold pocket watch glinting in the morning sun. To the casual observer, he was just another wealthy businessman, polished, confident, untouchable. But behind those sharp eyes, there was something more. Something restless. Something the world would never quite understand. Ellis Wainwright wasn't born into fortune. He clawed his way up, dealing in breweries, navigating the cutthroat world of beer in a city where success could vanish overnight. By the time he reached the height of his career, he had everything: power, wealth, influence. And yet the man who had touched the very pulse of St. Louis society wasn't satisfied. He wanted to leave a mark that would endure beyond his own life. Something timeless. Something the world could not ignore. Then came the tower. Rising abruptly from the city skyline, a towering monument of marble, stone, and sheer audacity. It wasn't just architecture. It was a statement. People whispered about it, stared at it, and some even mocked it. But Ellis didn't care. He poured his fortune into that tower as if he were building a bridge into eternity itself. It was rumored to be more than a monument. Some said it held secrets, a story encoded in its carvings, a reflection of a mind that refused to be ordinary. And then, he vanished. Just like that. The man who had loomed so large over St. Louis, the one who built that audacious tower, disappeared into the shadows of history. Some say he left to escape scandal. Others whisper of lost fortunes and secret retreats abroad. Newspapers speculated, historians puzzled, and the city slowly forgot. The tower remained silent and unmoving. A monument to a man who had chosen the world over his own fame, or perhaps fame over the world. So here's the question that lingers like a shadow over that silent structure. Why did Ellis Wainwright build a tower and then vanish from history? Would you have kept building, even if the world might never know your name? Before the tower, before the whispers of legend, Ellis Wainwright was just a man with ambition bigger than his means. St. Louis was a city of opportunity, but it was also a city of unforgiving streets and sharp elbows. Ellis worked in breweries, learning the trade from the ground up, counting barrels, negotiating with temperamental workers, sweating over contracts that could crumble with a single misstep. Every small failure cut deep, and every small success felt like a miracle. He had charm, intelligence, and a relentless drive, but the world wasn't kind to men who dared to dream too loudly. His first brewery ventures stumbled under poor timing, changing regulations, and a ruthless competition that seemed to enjoy crushing newcomers. Ellis lost money, friendships, and nights of sleep. Some evenings he would sit alone in his office, staring at the faint glow of a lamp, feeling the weight of both ambition and fear pressing down on his chest. Yet even in failure, something extraordinary simmered in him. He learned from each setback, not with bitterness, but with an almost obsessive hunger. He noticed patterns others ignored: the flow of money, the psychology of customers, the power of perception. He understood that to rise, he couldn't just work harder. He had to think differently. He had to become untouchable not just in wealth but in vision. Small victories began to emerge. A new brewery partnership that survived a stormy legal battle. A distribution deal that gave him a fraction of control over the city's beer supply. Every tiny win was a heartbeat, a pulse of proof that he could climb higher. And yet something inside him whispered that success wasn't enough. Not yet. Money alone would never satisfy Ellis Wainwright. He wanted permanence. Recognition that would outlast fleeting applause. Even as he tasted these early victories, there were shadows. Rivals who plotted against him, friends who envied him, and a society quick to judge ambition as arrogance. Some nights he walked through the gaslit streets of St. Louis, the wind tugging at his coat, the city whispering doubts into his ears. Is it worth it? The streets seemed to ask. But Ellis didn't answer with words. He answered with action, letting every failure fuel a vision no one else could see. And in the heart of those restless nights, a thought began to crystallize, a monument. Something that would scream his existence across time, something that would make even the critics pause. But before he could build, he had to survive the storms of ambition itself. And those storms were only beginning. By the turn of the century, Ellis Wainwright had begun to taste the power he had long chased. But it came with a cost heavier than gold. The breweries that once seemed like playgrounds of profit now demanded every ounce of his energy, every sharp decision, every gamble he could muster. Rivals lurked in the shadows, watching for any slip. One wrong move could erase years of hard-fought success. And the pressure? It gnawed at him like a relentless storm, whispering doubts when the night was quiet. Ellis wasn't immune to fear. There were evenings when he sat alone in his office, the city's fog pressing against the windows, and he felt the crushing weight of responsibility. Men depended on him, employees, partners, investors, and if he failed, their lives could unravel. The weight of expectation bore down on his shoulders like a tangible thing. But it was more than just duty. It was his hunger for legacy. He wasn't building breweries to be rich. He was building them to be remembered. Every move became a calculated risk. He poured money into expansions others deemed reckless. He challenged competitors publicly, his confidence masking a simmering anxiety. There were whispered scandals he narrowly avoided, lawsuits that could have destroyed him, and partnerships that frayed under the strain of ambition. Each victory was hard-won, each defeat nearly unbearable, and yet the idea of the tower began to take root, a vision that burned hotter than fear, hotter than doubt, hotter than everything else. Even in moments of triumph, loneliness crept in. His peers celebrated their social events. He walked past, feeling the hollow echo of isolation. Success had brought him far, but the higher he climbed, the more the world seemed to shrink around him. Friends faded, competitors multiplied, and every handshake carried the weight of calculation. It was a world where trust was fragile, and ambition was both a weapon and a curse. And yet, it was in these long, silent nights that Ellis's imagination soared. He pictured the tower again, not merely as stone and marble, but as a testament. A declaration that he existed, that his vision mattered, that he had dared to touch eternity while the rest of the world whispered about the fleeting moment. Every setback, every sleepless night, every whispered doubt, these became fuel, but ambition alone could not build a monument. To reach the heights he dreamed of, Ellis would have to risk everything: the fortune he had painstakingly built, the reputation he had carefully guarded, and perhaps even the very life he had fought to protect. And in that risk lay the moment that would define him forever. Ellis Wainwright's vision for the tower was no longer a distant dream. It had become an obsession that consumed him entirely. Every waking hour, every conversation, every decision was filtered through that singular purpose. He wandered the streets of St. Louis, imagining how the light would strike the tower at dawn, how shadows would fall at sunset, how people would look up and pause, compelled by its presence. In his mind, it was more than stone and mortar. It was a message to the world, a reflection of a man who refused to be forgotten. But obsession, as it often does, brought tension. Investors questioned the wisdom of such a lavish undertaking. Engineers warned of practical limitations. Critics whispered that the project was vanity cloaked in brilliance. Yet Ellis was relentless. He brushed off every doubt, smiled at every warning, and pressed forward. There was a fire in his eyes that no caution could quench, a fire that sometimes frightened even those closest to him. Small turning points began to accumulate, each one a spark lighting the path to creation. A rare meeting with a renowned architect provided the breakthrough he needed. A chance encounter with a philanthropist opened doors to funding he hadn't dared hope for. Even a failed attempt at acquiring a prime plot of land taught him lessons he could not have learned from books or advisors. These moments were fleeting, almost invisible to anyone else, but to Ellis, they were the threads weaving the fabric of destiny, and yet, with every step forward, the personal cost grew. He spent nights pacing his empty mansion, staring at shadows on the walls, imagining the city looking up and wondering, who built that? He became a figure both admired and feared, an enigma in the eyes of the public, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his isolation. Relationships frayed, friends faded. Conversations often ended abruptly, replaced by the hum of calculation, strategy, and vision. Through it all, he held a singular belief: greatness required risk, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment. The breweries, the money, the accolades, they were all part of the journey, but the tower was the destination. It wasn't just architecture. It was a declaration of intent, a challenge to the world to remember him, to wrestle with his audacity long after his footsteps faded from the streets. And in those quiet, obsessive moments, Ellis faced a question he could not ignore. Could one man truly defy history? Could he etch his name into time itself? Or would ambition collapse into mere legend, whispered and forgotten? The answer loomed like the skyline he was about to redefine, and every heartbeat drove him closer to the choice that would change everything. Then came the moment that would define Ellis Wainwright forever, the day he decided to pour everything into the tower. Not a fraction, not a cautious experiment, everything, his fortune, his reputation, his very life. Imagine the weight of that choice. A man standing at the pinnacle of wealth, staring at a vision no one else could see, knowing that every coin spent, every stone laid, could either cement his legacy or bury him in ruin. Construction began amid whispers of madness. Citizens gawked at the audacity of the project, critics wrote scathing editorials, and competitors secretly cheered for his downfall. Yet Ellis moved with precision. Every column, every arch, every carving was deliberate, a reflection of his mind and soul. He spent hours on the scaffolding, inspecting every detail, his eyes blazing with intensity, while the city below continued its hum, oblivious to the legend in the making. There were near disasters. A scaffolding collapse that could have ended his life, a funding shortage that threatened to halt progress. Even engineers questioned the stability of certain designs. But Ellis faced each challenge with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He negotiated, begged, argued, and when necessary, threatened, refusing to let any obstacle stop him. Each hurdle became fuel, each crisis a reaffirmation of why he had taken this risk. And then the tower rose block by block, piercing the St. Louis skyline like a declaration of defiance. It was more than architecture. It was a story frozen in marble, a monument of ambition and courage. People stopped to stare, some in awe, some in envy, others in fear. Ellis Wainwright had done what few dared to dream, and he did it with a confidence that seemed almost supernatural. But here's the tension that history almost forgot. Success did not bring peace. The tower drew attention, not all of it welcome. Rumors of corruption, bribery, and political scandals swirled around him. Every headline carried the dual weight of admiration and suspicion. Ellis had risked everything, and now the world was watching, ready to cheer, judge, or destroy him at a moment's notice. In that moment, standing at the pinnacle of his creation, Ellis faced a question few men ever encounter. Could a single act of audacious genius justify the sacrifices it demanded? Could ambition, when pushed to its limit, truly triumph over fear, doubt, and the judgment of society? As he gazed up at the nearly completed tower, sunlight glinting off its intricate carvings, the answer remained uncertain. And yet he had chosen the path irrevocably, daring history itself to catch up. The tower stood completed, majestic and unyielding. A testament to Ellis Wainwright's vision, but its very grandeur cast long shadows. Suddenly the world he had so carefully navigated seemed unpredictable and perilous. Scandals erupted like storms. Accusations of bribery and corruption began to swirl around his breweries. Rivals who had once whispered now shouted. The city that had once celebrated him now questioned his every move. And in the quiet moments, when he was alone in his mansion overlooking the skyline, Ellis felt the first pangs of fear, not for money, not for status, but for the fragile legacy he had so painstakingly built. Yet, for a man like Ellis, fear was a catalyst, not a cage. Every accusation, every smoldering rumor, every skeptical glance from the public fueled his relentless drive. He became more meticulous, more strategic, more elusive. He realized that brilliance alone could not protect him. He needed cunning, discretion, and the courage to disappear when necessary. And so, while the city marveled at his tower, Ellis began to withdraw, fading from public life in ways that only deepened the mystery. Some nights, he would walk past the tower, feeling the cold stone under his fingertips, remembering every decision that had brought him here, the sleepless nights, the near-ruined partnerships, the whispered threats, the personal sacrifices. The tower was his triumph, yet it was also a reminder of the razor's edge he had walked. His life had become a delicate balance between notoriety and survival, and he understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that one misstep could erase everything. In this period, small turning points shaped his mind like chisels on marble. He began divesting portions of his empire quietly, moving assets abroad, and surrounding himself with loyal confidants who understood discretion. Every action was calculated, almost imperceptible, a silent dance of strategy that left outsiders guessing. It was as though he were writing a story no one else would read, except history would eventually stumble upon the remnants. And yet, despite his withdrawal, the city could not ignore him entirely. The tower remained striking and provocative, a daily reminder of Ellis Wainwright's audacity. People wondered about him, speculated endlessly, and in their curiosity, he achieved a form of immortality. The very act of vanishing, of stepping back from the public eye, became part of the legend. A man who dared to build something eternal and then fade into shadows. Ellis had discovered something profound, that legacy is not simply about being remembered. Sometimes it is about controlling the narrative, choosing the moment and leaving the world to question your story. And as whispers of scandal and genius swirled around him, he prepared for the ultimate act, an exit that would cement his mystery forever. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared in St. Louis society, Ellis Wainwright vanished. One day he walked the streets, attended meetings, shook hands with powerful men. The next he was gone. No farewell, no announcement, no trace in the public eye. The newspapers speculated, the city gossiped, but nothing concrete emerged. It was as if the man had been swallowed by the very ambition that had made him great. His disappearance became a puzzle, a whisper carried by the wind through the streets, a question echoing off the walls of the tower he had left behind. The consequences of his choices were profound. His breweries continued under the management of others, profits fluctuating, alliances shifting, but the man himself became legend rather than participant. Some say he moved to Europe, living in relative anonymity. Others suggest he indulged in travel, art, and private reflection, away from the cutthroat pressures of his former life. Whatever the reality, Ellis had mastered one final audacious risk, controlling the final chapter of his own story. Emotionally, the vanishing speaks volumes. Imagine a man who had poured his soul into creation, who had faced relentless fear and ambition, who had built something meant to outlast himself, and then stepped back entirely, choosing mystery over comfort, enigma over recognition. It is a rare courage, almost unthinkable, to achieve greatness, then relinquish the very stage that defined it. It is a lesson not just in business or architecture, but in psychology. The understanding that the mind's freedom can sometimes surpass material success. And the tower? It stood as both monument and message. Citizens would gaze up, questioning why a man capable of so much had disappeared. They debated the meaning of his silence, the weight of his legacy, and the audacity of vanishing at the peak of his life. In that silence, Ellis communicated something powerful, that ambition need not always be tethered to the eyes of the world, that sometimes the greatest power is knowing when to step back, when to let creation speak louder than presence. Even decades later, his story resonates. Business historians, curious minds, and storytellers of the extraordinary trace his steps, analyze his motives, and speculate about his life in ways he could never have controlled, but perhaps that was the point. The ultimate mastery of risk is not just in creation or conquest, but in the subtle act of retreat, leaving others to interpret the magnitude of your vision. And as the shadows lengthen over the tower, one can almost hear his thoughts echoing through the stone. I dared, I built, and I chose my own exit. It is both haunting and inspiring, a psychological lesson that lingers in the imagination of anyone who dares to chase legacy over security. The tower still stands today, quiet and unwavering, a sentinel of ambition against the ever-changing St. Louis skyline. Passers-by rarely know the story of Ellis Wainwright, the man who risked everything, built something magnificent, and then disappeared without a trace. But in its shadows, in the careful carvings and soaring arches, his presence lingers. It whispers of audacity, obsession, and the fragile line between genius and isolation. Ellis teaches us something uncomfortable yet profound. Greatness often comes at a cost no one else can measure. He understood that to make history, you must sometimes walk alone, face doubt that no one else can see, and make choices that defy conventional logic. He risked fortune, reputation, and certainty, not for applause, not for the fleeting recognition of the world, but to create something that would outlast him. And then, in the ultimate act of control, he vanished, leaving only the monument and the questions that continue to haunt us today. Imagine yourself in his shoes for a moment. You've built something extraordinary, poured your life into it, and the world is watching. Would you stand in the spotlight, subject to judgment, envy, and scrutiny? Or would you, like Ellis, step back, retreat, and let your creation speak louder than your presence ever could? It is a choice few are brave enough to make, a choice that forces us to question what legacy truly means, and what courage really looks like, in the end. Ellis Wainwright's story is not just about beer, buildings, or wealth. It's about the human spirit, the drive to create and the audacity to control your narrative. He reminds us that sometimes the greatest triumph is knowing when to risk everything and when to walk away, leaving the world to wrestle with the echoes of your ambition. So here's the question that lingers in the quiet corners of that silent tower. If life tested you like it tested Ellis, would you have dared to build? Would you have risked everything? And if the world could never fully understand your vision, would you still have gone all the way? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Would you have taken the risk or walked away?